David, you've noted that the use of a behavioral assessment is a fundamental part of your coaching practice. Can you talk more about your preferred assessment tool and how you determined it would be best in your work?
Yes, happy to. There are a number of behavioral assessments in the coaching world and just in business and life in general. There are so many ways in which behaviors are assessed or people can ultimately move through some sort of questionnaire, some survey to assess an aspect of themselves. In the work of coaching, I have an interest in ensuring that my clients have enough of a perspective of how they show up, how they approach people relationships. I use Myers Briggs Type Indicator Step 2 as an example. I found, by the way, that that particular instrument is one of the most grounded in behavioral science, so I appreciate that. And also is a manageable tool. There's a lot of nuance to it because we're complex people. And thus, there isn't a simple distinction between one behavioral preference or another. There's a range of ways in which we show up. And it's important to note that behavioral assessments should not be viewed as a means of determining the extent to which someone can perform their job. Companies sometimes make a mistake of using behavioral assessments to gauge the extent to which a candidate may or may not be a fit within their company. And I strongly encourage companies not to use behavioral assessments in that way because everyone comes with a personal story. They may be dealing with grief in that moment, or they may have some level of anxiety or depression that they're managing through, or they may have an addiction that they're trying to get on top of. All of these personal story elements that may cause someone to be slightly off their game. And to have a behavioral assessment to somehow try to suss that out and determine whether someone's a fit or not is simply not fair. Behavioral assessments cannot determine whether someone will show up with positivity or will show up with creative ideas or will take initiative or, as I mentioned in an earlier session, will operate with integrity and ethics and a solid moral compass. So behavioral assessments have to be carefully managed in the case of coaching in a way in which we're able to gain a bit of a sense of behavioral natures that people bring with them, that they just have a natural wiring towards. I use that term because people tend to get it rather quickly. But a behavioral assessment, in the case of, say, Myers Briggs, looks at whether someone is more of an introvert by nature or an extrovert by nature. Nothing wrong with either, but it can determine how they necessarily approach people relationships at work and socially. And in our coaching sessions, we're approaching this from workplace relationships. And then it also looks at how they manage structure, how they approach process, and how they look at whether they are more inclined to see the world in front of them or they can infer a more abstract world in a future state. So all of those things wrap around a behavioral assessment. And there's no right or wrongs that come from that, but there's self-awareness that can come from it. As I've said before, how someone shows up through the work of behavioral assessment is to ultimately determine whether they know that under stress, they may overly rely on a preferred behavioral style, which could be to the detriment of a relationship they have with someone that they're working with. So sometimes, for example, I may encourage extroverted leaders to be sensitive to the fact that if they have a group of mostly introverts that they're working with or speaking to or managing, that putting someone on the spot to say, hey, why don't we brainstorm? And let's just throw out ideas. That may not be the best way for someone who's introverted to come up with their best thinking. So a gift to an introvert, for instance, would be to say, listen, why don't you come back with your best ideas on this. That's a gift because then an introvert will typically process, think it through, and come back with their preferred and best ideas. That's the nature typically of someone who has that profile. So we dig into these elements of behavioral styles. And again, there's a number of different behavioral assessments, a lot of tools out there that are validated. I find that some of them are better suited for team type of work instead of individual work. And then some of them just may not necessarily have easy handles to draw from. With the Myers Briggs, you have a 4 letter acronym that is the highest level representation of your behavioral nature. And as a result, it's a handy way to sum up what is admittedly underneath, layered and layered and layered with the uniqueness of the individual, as it should. And that's the early work of behavioral assessments in a coaching relationship because it's a safe starting point. No right or wrong answers, but we do want to ensure that the client is more thoughtful, more reflective on how do I show up? What does stress do for me and my emotional intelligence when I'm dealing with very challenging conditions in the workplace? And does it cause me to not necessarily be at my best or help others be at their best as we work together? So that's behavioral assessment work in coaching.